Camp Maha, Texas, June 1943. The mess hall doors opened, and the smell hit them first charred fat, searing meat, something primal that made Corporal Ernst Weber's knees weaken. On the serving line, American cooks were grilling steaks, actual steaks, thick as a man's fist, one for each prisoner. Ernst hadn't seen meat like this since 1941. In Germany, livestock had disappeared into military logistics or starvation, beef becoming memory rather than meal. He watched a guard flip a steak and heard another prisoner whisper in German, "I haven't seen meat in 2 years." The words hung in the air like smoke. What followed would challenge everything they'd been told about American weakness. Ernst Weber was 26 years old, from a small farming town in Bavaria, where his family had raised dairy cattle for 3 generations. He'd been conscripted in 1940, had fought in France and North Africa, had been captured in Tunisia when German forces finally collapsed under overwhelming Allied pressure. But more than combat or capture, what haunted him was the disappearance of food from German life. The transformation had been gradual. In 1940, rationing was inconvenient but manageable. By 1941, meat became scarce, appearing in shops sporadically, requiring connections or luck to obtain. By 1942, livestock had been either requisitioned for military use or slaughtered to prevent enemy capture as fronts collapsed. Beef, pork, chicken all became fantasies, mentioned in hushed conversations about pre-war abundance that felt increasingly mythical. Ernst remembered the last time he'd seen a cow in Bavaria, spring of 1941, before his unit deployed east. The Weber family farm had 5 dairy cattle then, animals his father had tended for decades. The military came that summer and requisitioned 3 for meat production. The remaining 2 died the following winter when feed disappeared, and his aging father couldn't maintain them properly. Letters from home stopped mentioning livestock entirely, focused instead on survival through potatoes and bread and whatever could be grown in gardens that used to feed animals now gone. Private Otto Liman had similar memories from Hamburg. His family ran a butcher shop that his grandfather had established in 1890, 3 generations serving the neighborhood, known for quality meat and fair prices. The shop closed in 1942 when there was simply nothing left to butcher. Otto's father had kept the building, hoping to reopen after the war, but hope faded as Hamburg burned and scarcity deepened from wartime rationing into something closer to starvation. Sergeant Franz Richter, career soldier from Prussia, had watched military rations decline steadily from 1941 onward. Early in the war, soldiers ate adequately, if not lavishly, meat several times weekly. Bread, vegetables, enough to sustain combat operations. By 1942, the meat rations shrank to watery stews, where finding actual beef pieces became treasure hunt. By 1943, when his unit retreated across Tunisia, they were eating whatever they could scavenge, the supply lines too disrupted for organized feeding. The journey to America had begun the slow psychological adjustment. British and American forces fed captured prisoners field rations that included tinned meat spam or corned beef, processed but protein nonetheless, more substantial than anything Ernst had eaten in months. The transport ship crossing the Atlantic served meals regularly, including occasional meat dishes that seemed impossibly generous, given that these were enemy prisoners being fed by nations Germany was actively trying to destroy. But nothing prepared them for Texas, for Camp Maha, for that June evening when the mess hall served steaks. The prisoners had arrived at Camp Maha that morning, transported by train from New York, across a continent so vast it made Germany seem cramped. They'd processed through intake medical examinations, delousing, uniform exchange, with the exhausted compliance of men too tired to resist, too uncertain to hope. The camp was new, built in 1942, wooden barracks surrounding a central compound, guard towers at corners, everything efficient and temporary, designed for wartime necessity rather than permanent occupation. The evening meal was announced at 1700 hours. The prisoners filed into the mess hall, expecting the same fare they'd received on the journey, adequate but modest, enough to sustain but not satisfy. Food that acknowledged they needed feeding, but didn't pretend they deserved pleasure. Instead, they found American cooks working flat-top grills, flames licking the edges of steaks that sizzled and popped as fat rendered into smoke that filled the building with smell so powerful it felt almost violent. Ernst stopped in the doorway, causing a backup of prisoners behind him, who had the same reaction, a moment of disbelief so profound it became physical paralysis. The American serving line moved prisoners through with efficient friendliness. 1 steak per man, baked potato, green beans, bread, butter, coffee. Real coffee. The portions were generous, didn't capture it. They were American, which Ernst was beginning to understand meant abundant in ways propaganda had insisted was impossible for a weak, decadent democracy. He received his tray and carried it to a table in stunned silence, sat beside Otto and Franz, and the 3 men stared at their meals without speaking. The steak was perhaps 8 ounces, cooked medium, marked with grill lines, still steaming. The potato was split and filled with butter that melted into yellow pools. The beans glistened with what looked like bacon fat. The bread was soft, white, fresh enough to compress under his fingers. Otto spoke first, his voice barely above whisper. "I haven't seen meat like this in 2 years. Maybe longer. My father's shop was empty by 1942. We ate horse meat when we could get it, dog when we couldn't. This..." He gestured at the steak, unable to find words. "This is what we were told Americans couldn't sustain. This is what propaganda said was illusion." Franz cut a piece of his steak, the knife parting the meat easily, revealing interior cooked to perfect pink. He put it in his mouth and chewed slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, pleasure, something close to anger. "They're feeding us enemy prisoners, better than Germany feeds its soldiers," he said quietly in German. "Better than civilians eat back home. This single meal has more protein than most German families see in a week. What does that tell you about everything we were told?" Ernst couldn't respond because he was crying, tears running down his face while he ate, unable to stop either the weeping or the eating. The steak tasted like memory from before the war, from childhood when his father would occasionally slaughter a steer, and the family would feast, from a world where abundance existed and hunger was temporary rather than constant. But it also tasted like betrayal of propaganda's lies, of his own complicity in believing them, of the realization that Germany had sent him to fight a nation with resources so vast they could feed enemy prisoners luxuriously while German civilians starved. Around them, other prisoners had similar reactions. Some ate mechanically, as if afraid the food would disappear if they acknowledged it. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite, making the meal last as long as possible. Some couldn't eat at all, overwhelmed by cognitive dissonance between what they'd been taught and what sat on their trays. A few wept like Ernst, emotions too complicated for simple categories, gratitude and grief and rage and relief all mixed together into response that had no adequate expression. That evening, in the barracks after lights out, the prisoners debated the meal as meaning in hushed German that guards couldn't understand, but didn't need to. The tone conveyed the content well enough. The conversations ranged from denial to acceptance, from rationalization to fury, each man processing contradiction between propaganda and reality at his own pace. Lieutenant Hans Müller, the senior German officer among the prisoners, tried to maintain ideological consistency. "This is psychological warfare," he insisted. "They feed us well to make us soft, to break our will to resist, to turn us into collaborators who forget our duty to the fatherland. Don't be deceived by American abundance. It's temporary, designed to manipulate us." But Ernst challenged him with question others were thinking. "Sir, if this is manipulation, Why does it work so well? Why does the truth of this meal that America can afford to feed enemies generously feel more real than propagandist claims about? American weakness? Maybe we were lied to. Maybe everything we were told was false. The argument spread through the barracks, variations repeated at different bunks. Some prisoners clung to Muller's interpretation, unable to accept that their sacrifices had been based on lies. Others experienced the stake as revelation, proof that propaganda had been systematically false, that Germany had sent them to fight an enemy whose resource base made victory impossible from the start. Otto Lemon, the butcher's son, had professional perspective that others lacked. "I know meat," he said to men gathered around his bunk. "I know what quality beef costs, what resources are required to raise cattle to this size and quality. That steak we ate tonight represents land, water, feed, time resources deployed casually for prisoners. If they can afford this for enemies, imagine what they deploy for their own military and civilians. Germany doesn't have this capacity, maybe never had it. The regime told us American abundance was propaganda, but we just ate the proof it's real." Franz Richter, the career sergeant, approached it from military logistics. They're feeding 600 prisoners here, probably thousands across multiple camps. If every prisoner gets a steak weekly, and I've heard from guards, this isn't unusual. That's enormous resource deployment. The supply chains alone, the refrigeration, the transportation infrastructure required to deliver fresh meat to camps across America. We don't have those capabilities in Germany. Maybe couldn't have them even at our peak. This isn't just about food. This is about economic capacity we were told didn't exist. The meals continued. Not steak every day. The menu varied through beef stew, fried chicken, pork chops, meatloaf, but always substantial, always including protein that most prisoners hadn't seen regularly since before the war. Breakfast brought bacon or sausage. Lunch included sandwich meat or canned tuna. Dinner featured main courses that would have been special occasions in Germany, even before rationing. Ernst found himself gaining weight for the first time since 1940. His uniform, which had hung loose from North African malnutrition and transport deprivation, began fitting properly. His face filled out, hollows disappearing, color returning to skin that had been gray with exhaustion and inadequate nutrition. Other prisoners showed similar transformation, men becoming healthy while captives, thriving in imprisonment in ways they hadn't during military service. The cognitive dissonance deepened with every meal. How could this be happening? How could defeat feel like recovery? How could enemies provide better care than their own military had? The questions had no comfortable answers, just the undeniable reality of food arriving 3 times daily, of bodies healing from deprivation, of propaganda's promises revealed as comprehensive lies. The work details began in the second week. German prisoners assigned to local farms where American manpower had been depleted by military service. Ernst was sent to a cattle ranch outside Maha, where he worked alongside a rancher named Tom Harrison, who was 63, too old for military service, struggling to maintain operations with his sons in the Pacific and Europe. Harrison needed labor. Ernst needed to understand where the stakes came from. The ranch held perhaps 300 head of cattle, grazing on land that seemed impossibly vast to someone from Bavaria, where every acre was carefully managed and livestock competed with humans for scarce space. Harrison explained his operation, the breeding program, the feeding schedules, the market economics of beef production. He spoke casually about numbers that stunned Ernst, selling 50 steers per year, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, calculating profit margins as if abundance was ordinary rather than miraculous. "Do you understand what you have here?" Ernst asked in broken English one afternoon, gesturing at the grazing cattle. "In Germany, we had maybe 5 cows for an entire village by 1942. You have 300 just for your family operation." Harrison considered before responding. "Son, this ain't even a big ranch by Texas standards. Some operations run thousands of head. America's got land and water and feed crops. We can raise cattle in numbers that probably seem impossible where you're from. That's just geography and economics. Nothing magical about it. The explanation was devastating in its simplicity. American abundance wasn't illusion or temporary luck. It was structural, built into geography and economic systems that generated surplus rather than required constant extraction. Germany couldn't compete with that, even if every strategic decision had been perfect, every military operation successful. The resource gap was too fundamental, too vast, too rooted in realities. Propaganda couldn't change by denying them. By July, prisoners were allowed to write letters home, censored but permitted, 1 page per week through Red Cross channels. Ernst sat in the barracks with paper and pencil, trying to figure out what he could say that censors would allow and that would devastate his family with knowledge of American abundance while they starved. He wrote, "Dear Mama, I am well and safe in America. The journey was long, but not terrible. We are treated according to international agreements. The food is adequate. I work on a cattle ranch learning about American agriculture. Do not worry for me. Focus on your own survival, and we will reunite when this war ends. Your son, Ernst." Adequate was grotesque understatement, but what else could he say? That he'd eaten steak while she probably survived on bread and potatoes? That he was gaining weight while she likely grew thinner? That American abundance made German scarcity look like policy failure rather than wartime inevitability? The truth felt cruel, so he wrote careful lies that preserved hope without revealing the full extent of contradiction between his captivity and her freedom. Otto's letters to his father at the closed butcher shop were more honest, perhaps because butchers understood meat in ways that made deception impossible. He wrote, "Papa, I have seen American beef production at scale I never imagined possible. They raise cattle in numbers that would have supplied Hamburg for months. The prisoners here eat meat, almost daily quality meat, properly prepared, portions that would have been luxury in the shop. I don't know how to reconcile this with what we were told about American weakness. I just know the evidence is undeniable, and it challenges everything." Franz wrote to his wife with military precision that couldn't quite hide his emotional turmoil. The Americans have resources we were told they lacked. Their logistics work flawlessly. Their food production exceeds both military and civilian needs with enough surplus to feed prisoners generously. I think about our rations in Tunisia, the watery stews, the weeks without meat, the constant hunger. Here I eat better than I did before the war. This isn't criticism of you or home. This is recognition that we were sent to fight an enemy whose capacity we fundamentally misunderstood. I love you. I miss you. I'm sorry for what's coming when Germany must face this truth at larger scale. America's independence. Day fell on a Sunday in 1943, and Camp Maha organized celebration that introduced prisoners to American patriotic culture. The camp commander, Colonel Richard Stevens, decided that including German prisoners in the festivities might demonstrate American values while giving prisoners a glimpse of the culture they'd been fighting against. The celebration centered on food, naturally. The cooks prepared special feast barbecued beef brisket that had been smoking since the previous evening, potato salad, coleslaw, baked beans, corn on the cob, watermelon for dessert. The portions were generous, even by American standards, meant to showcase abundance and generosity. American flags hung everywhere. Patriotic bunting decorated the mess hall, and the camp band played marches that prisoners didn't recognize, but whose triumphant tones communicated clearly enough. Ernst stood in the serving line, watching brisket being sliced, seeing portions that would have fed his entire family in Bavaria, feeling the disconnect between his prisoner status and the treatment he was receiving. An American chaplain said a prayer in English that the translator conveyed, thanking God for abundance, for America's blessings, for victory that was coming, for the opportunity to show mercy to enemies even while at war. The prayer was confident, assuming divine favor, expecting triumph, the spiritual expression of material abundance prisoners had been experiencing through meals. They ate family style, prisoners and guards at the same tables, sharing the same food, temporarily suspending the adversarial relationship that technically defined their interaction. Ernst sat across from a guard named Williams, a farm boy from Iowa, who was 19 and friendly in the way, a people raised with abundance who couldn't quite imagine scarcity. Williams talked about his family's farm, about his plans after the war, about American optimism that assumed futures were bright and problems were solvable and resources were adequate for dreams. The beef brisket was extraordinary slow smoked until it fell apart, fatty and tender, seasoned simply, served with sauce that was sweet and tangy. Ernst ate slowly, thinking about his father's cattle that had been requisitioned and probably slaughtered, poorly by military butchers who didn't know or care about proper technique. He thought about his mother surviving on whatever she could trade or grow. He thought about Germany's propaganda, insisting American abundance was myth, while he sat eating proof it was real. Otto approached the day professionally, analyzing the brisket with butcher's expertise. The meat quality was excellent, well marbled, properly aged, cooked with skill and patience. The quantity was staggering, probably serving 800 people, prisoners and staff, with generous portions. He calculated rough numbers, maybe 300 pounds of brisket, requiring multiple animals, resources deployed for single celebration, abundance as statement rather than necessity. After the meal, Stevens addressed the assembled prisoners through translator. He spoke about American values, freedom, democracy, generosity, the belief that even enemies deserve decent treatment. He acknowledged the war, the losses on both sides, the tragedy of conflict between peoples who might have been friends under different circumstances. Then he said something that landed like physical blow. We feed you well, not because we're soft, but because we can afford mercy. That's not weakness. That's the strength that comes from abundance and confidence in our values. You were told America was weak. This meal is evidence we're not. Remember that when you think about how this war ends, the speech was brilliant propaganda. Ernst realized demonstrating American power through generosity, challenging German propaganda by proving it false through direct experience, making prisoners question everything they believed by forcing them to confront undeniable reality. He hated it for being manipulation, but he couldn't deny it was effective. How could you maintain faith in regime's promises when enemies' actions demonstrated those promises were lies? August brought heat that turned the barracks into ovens and made outdoor work almost unbearable. But it also brought breaking point for Lieutenant Mueller, the officer who'd been insisting American generosity was psychological warfare designed to break prisoners' will. One evening, after a dinner of fried chicken that was remarkable only for being unremarkable, just another good meal in series of good meals, Mueller stood and announced he could no longer maintain the pretense. I've been telling you this treatment is temporary manipulation, he said to assembled prisoners in their barracks. That America's abundance is illusion, that we're being fattened for some ulterior purpose. But I can't sustain that belief anymore. We've been here 2 months. The food hasn't decreased. The treatment hasn't deteriorated. We're gaining weight while our families starve. This isn't manipulation. This is reality. America has resources we were told they lacked. They're feeding us generously because they can afford to, not because they're trying to trick us. I was wrong. The propaganda was wrong. Everything we were told was lies. The admission created space for others to acknowledge what they'd been thinking but hadn't voiced. Franz Richter talked about comparing American supply chains to German logistics and recognizing the vast gap in capability. Otto Lehmann described learning about American agricultural systems and understanding that Germany couldn't match that productivity even under ideal conditions. Ernst Weber spoke about working on Harrison S. Ranch and seeing cattle abundance that made German livestock seemed pitiful by comparison. Not everyone accepted immediately. Some prisoners clung to ideology, arguing that admitting propaganda was false meant admitting their sacrifices had been meaningless, that comrades had died for lies, that everything they'd suffered was pointless. The psychological cost of that recognition was too high, so they rejected the evidence in front of them, constructing elaborate rationalizations for why American stakes didn't mean what they obviously meant. But most prisoners reached similar conclusions, slower perhaps than Mueller, but arriving at the same destination. The meals had been cumulative proof that challenged ideology with experience impossible to dismiss. You could deny one steak dinner. You couldn't deny 2 months of consistent abundance, of bodies recovering from malnutrition, of enemy generosity that exceeded their own military's provisions. As prisoners accepted their situation, their attitudes toward work details shifted. Initially, they'd approached labor with resentment-captured soldiers forced to work for enemies. But gradually, work became something more complicated, opportunity to learn, to contribute, to prepare for futures in Germany that would require reconstruction skills more than military training. Ernst's work at Harrison's ranch evolved from simple labor to genuine education. Harrison taught him about pasture management, about cattle breeding programs, about economic calculations that determined which animals to keep and which to sell. The knowledge was practical, but also symbolic demonstration that agriculture could be scientific, rather than just traditional, that abundance came from systematic improvement, rather than just hard work or ideology. Harrison noticed Ernst's intelligence and began treating him less like employee and more like apprentice. One afternoon, taking a break in the shade of Harrison's pickup truck, the old rancher spoke about his own father, about learning to ranch from him, about traditions that connected him to land and livestock in ways that transcended economics. "That's what I'm teaching you, son," Harrison said. "Not just how to raise cattle, but why it matters. When you go home after this war, Germany's going to need feeding. You've learned some things here that might help with that. Use them well." The suggestion that Ernst would go home, that Germany would survive defeat, that his knowledge might contribute to reconstruction. These ideas gave captivity purpose beyond mere survival. He started taking notes, sketching diagrams, documenting American agricultural techniques he could apply in Bavaria once the war ended. The notebooks became obsession, filling pages with information about breed selection, feeding schedules, veterinary care, everything Harrison shared. Otto found similar purpose working in the camp kitchen, where American cooks taught him techniques and recipes that transformed his understanding of food preparation. He learned about refrigeration systems that made fresh meat distribution possible, about supply chain logistics that delivered ingredients reliably, about standardization that allowed cooking at scale while maintaining quality. The knowledge was professional, but also philosophical recognition that feeding people well was craft worth taking seriously, that abundance created space for attention to quality that scarcity eliminated. Franz Richter was assigned to maintenance work, repairing camp infrastructure, learning about American construction techniques and materials. He'd been career soldier, had no civilian skills beyond military training, but found himself fascinated by American efficiency in building and maintaining facilities. The camp was temporary, built quickly, but it worked. Plumbing functioned. Electricity flowed reliably. Structures withstood Texas heat and occasional storms. That practical competence, that ability to build systems that functioned properly, impressed him more than military discipline ever had. December 1943 brought the prisoner's first Christmas in captivity, and the camp administration decided to mark it with special meals that acknowledged the holiday's significance while demonstrating continued American abundance. The planning committee, which included German prisoner representatives, designed a menu that would be generous even by American standards. Prime rib, Yorkshire pudding, roasted vegetables, German-style red cabbage made by prisoners using American ingredients. Stalin attempting to replicate traditional Christmas bread. The prime rib was centerpiece, massive roasts that had been carefully aged and would be carved tableside, each prisoner receiving substantial portion. Ernst watched the preparation with disbelief that had become familiar abundance as routine rather than exceptional. Resources deployed casually for prisoners' holiday meal. The prime rib alone probably represented more meat than his entire village would see in a month, served to enemy prisoners by nation that could afford such generosity while still fighting war on multiple continents. Colonel Stevens addressed the prisoners before the Christmas meal, his words translated carefully. This is season of peace and hope. We're still at war, still enemies in technical sense. But we're also humans sharing this holiday, sharing this meal, sharing recognition that someday this conflict will end and we'll need to find ways to live together. This dinner is our gift to you, not because you've earned it, but because our values require showing mercy even to enemies. We hope you'll carry forward that lesson when you go home. The meal was extraordinary, not just for quality, but for what it represented. The cumulative weight of 6 months of good feeding, of propaganda demolished by direct experience, of bodies and minds recovering from deprivation and lies. Ernst ate his prime rib slowly, thinking about his family's Christmas that would be marked by scarcity and fear and absence. He felt the familiar guilt of surviving comfortably while others suffered, but also growing recognition that his survival served a purpose. He would carry home knowledge about what abundance looked like, about how enemies could show mercy, about the lies they'd all been told. Otto carved his prime rib with professional appreciation, noting the quality of the cut, the proper aging, the skillful cooking that had brought meat to perfect medium rare. He thought about his father's closed butcher shop, about the grandfather who'd established it believing in craft and quality and treating customers fairly. When he went home, Otto decided he'd reopen that shop with everything he'd learned from American abundance, not just techniques, but philosophy about food being worthy of attention and resources, about feeding people well being civilization's fundamental responsibility. Franz ate his Christmas dinner with military assessment that couldn't quite suppress emotional response. The meal was strategic, designed to demonstrate American power through generosity, to challenge German prisoners' certainties by proving propaganda false through overwhelming evidence. It was manipulation, but honest manipulation. The Americans weren't lying about their abundance, just deploying it strategically to win psychological victories. Franz had to respect the approach, even while recognizing himself as target. War was war, and this was weapon as effective as artillery, maybe more so because it left prisoners alive but transformed. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945, and repatriation planning began immediately, though execution would take many months. Ernst was notified in July that he'd be sailing in September, returning to Bremen, and then making his way through occupied Germany to wherever Bavaria had become. The news brought relief and dread in equal measure, wanting to go home, fearing what home had become, knowing his comfortable captivity was ending and much harder phase was beginning. His final weeks at Camp Maha, he worked to finish his notebooks, to document everything Harrison had taught him, to prepare for the reconstruction work he'd need to do. Harrison invited him to the ranch house for farewell dinner, where Ernst met his wife and teenage daughter, where they ate steak one final time, while Harrison talked about post-war Germany needing young men with knowledge and skills and determination to rebuild properly. "You learned good stuff here, son," Harrison said. "Use it to help your people. Show them that enemies can become friends, that abundance is possible through production rather than conquest, that paying attention to doing things right matters more than taking shortcuts. Germany's going to need those lessons. You carry them home." Ernst sailed from New York in September 1945 with his notebooks and his transformed understanding of propaganda and reality. The Germany he found was unrecognizable cities destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, population starving, economy shattered. His family had survived his mother, his younger sister, but his father had died in 1944 from illness exacerbated by malnutrition and stress. They lived in 2 rooms of a building that was more standing than most, surviving on Allied rations that were adequate but minimal. Nothing like American abundance Ernst had experienced. He showed his mother his notebooks, explained what he'd learned about cattle ranching and agricultural science and American systems that generated surplus. She wept reading them, not from grief, but from complicated mixture of emotions. Pride that her son had survived and learned. Grief that his father hadn't lived to see this knowledge relief, that maybe future would be better than present suggested. "We'll rebuild," she said, slowly, painfully, "but we'll rebuild. You'll help with that. These notebooks are your contribution." Ernst reopened the family farm in 1946, starting small with 2 cattle purchased from American occupation forces, applying techniques learned from Harrison to Bavarian conditions. The operation grew gradually 5 cattle by 1948, 12 by 1950, 30 by 1955. He never achieved American-scale abundance, but he built something sustainable, something that fed family and neighbors, something that proved prosperity was possible through production rather than conquest. He kept his final stake memory from Camp Maha, not physical souvenir, but psychological marker, moment when propaganda met reality and reality won decisively. That memory guided his decisions for decades, to trust evidence over ideology, to learn from enemies who proved decent, to recognize that abundance came from systems, rather than slogans, to teach his children that cooperation was more effective than conflict. Otto returned to Hamburg in October 1945, found his father alive and a butcher shop standing though empty. They reopened in 1946 using Otto's American training, applying lessons about refrigeration and supply chains and quality control. The shop thrived during Reconstruction, became gathering place where Otto served customers and told stories about American abundance, about enemies who'd shown mercy, about propaganda's lies and truth's eventual triumph. Franz Richter stayed in the American military briefly after repatriation, working for occupation forces as translator and administrative assistant. He used that position to help implement reconstruction programs, to facilitate communication between German civilians and American administrators, to demonstrate that former enemies could cooperate toward shared goals. He retired from military life in 1950, took civilian job with construction company rebuilding German infrastructure, applied American efficiency methods he'd observed during captivity. Ernst Weber lived until 2003, dying at age 86, having built successful farming operation and raised 4 children, who grew up knowing abundance their father had only encountered as prisoner of war. Among his possessions, his children found the notebooks from Camp Maha pages documenting Harrison's teachings, sketches of cattle and facilities, notes about American abundance and German potential. They found also a journal entry from December 1943, written after that Christmas prime rib dinner. "Today I ate better than I ate at any Christmas before the war. I am prisoner of nation," we were told was weak and decadent. They feed us generously while our families starve. Every meal here demolishes more propaganda, challenges more certainties, forces more recognition that we were lied to completely. The hardest part isn't captivity. It's knowing that my comfortable imprisonment came at cost of others' suffering, that I eat well while Mama starves. But I am beginning to think my survival serves purpose. I carry home knowledge about what abundance looks like, about how prosperity is built through systems rather than stolen through conquest, about enemies who chose mercy when vengeance would have been justified. That knowledge might be the most important thing I bring back to Germany, more valuable than military experience, more necessary for rebuilding than combat skills. The steak I ate today wasn't just food. It was education, demonstration, proof that everything we were taught was false. I'll remember this meal for rest of my life. We'll measure all future abundance against American generosity, to prisoners who tried to destroy them. That's the victory that lasts, not the military defeat, but the recognition that they were better than we were in ways that mattered more than warfare. The journal and notebooks were donated to museum documenting POW experiences, where they sit in archives alongside thousands of similar testimonies about propaganda meeting reality and reality proving stronger. The documents aren't unique or historically exceptional, just one prisoner's account of transformation through meals, of ideology challenged by evidence, of recognizing that enemies could teach valuable lessons if pride didn't prevent learning. The steak Ernst Weber ate in June 1943 was consumed 80 years ago. The cattle that provided it are long dead. Tom Harrison's ranch has passed through 2 more generations. Camp Maha was dismantled in 1945, its buildings sold for scrap, its land returned to other purposes. But the psychological transformation at stake represented the moment when propaganda met abundance, and couldn't survive the collision echoes forward through decades of German-American relations, through Marshall Plan rebuilding that applied some lessons learned during captivity, through generations who grew up taking for granted cooperation that prisoners once thought impossible. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't violence, but abundance that proves enemy propaganda false, mercy that challenges certainties about warfare and humanity, meals that transform understanding more effectively than bombs could shatter cities. Ernst Weber learned that lesson through steak in a Texas prisoner of war camp in 1943, carried it home to Bavaria, applied it to rebuilding, and passed it forward to children who inherited more than farms. They inherited knowledge that enemies could become friends if both sides chose learning over hatred, if abundance was shared rather than hoarded, if the strongest response to defeat was mercy that enabled reconstruction rather than vengeance that perpetuated destruction. The steak is gone, but its legacy persists in every meal eaten without thinking about scarcity, in every cooperation between former enemies, in every moment when abundance enables generosity that challenges someone's certainties and opens possibility for transformation. That's the victory that lasts longest, not the defeat inflicted, but the understanding enabled, not the hunger imposed, but the abundance shared, not the propaganda maintained, but the truth revealed through something as simple and profound as steak served to prisoners who hadn't seen meat in 2 years and couldn't deny what that meant about everything they'd been taught to believe.